A racist doctor refuses to treat a black man because the doctor assumes that the man is faking his injury. The next day, the doctor is shocked when the black man teaches him a lesson. Marcus Harris pulled into the parking lot of the small-town hospital, the old sedan's engine rattling as it shut off. The pain in his abdomen had started as a dull ache earlier in the day, but by the time the sun had set, it felt like a knife twisting inside him. He winced, clutching his side as he stepped out of the car. His normally steady gait was reduced to a hunched shuffle as he made his way to the entrance. The automatic doors hissed open, and the harsh fluorescent lights of the emergency room greeted him. The place was busy, but not chaotic. A few patients sat slumped in the worn-out chairs, staring at the outdated magazines scattered on the coffee tables. Marcus approached the reception desk, where a young nurse in scrubs was typing something into a computer. Her face was blank, focused on the screen in front of her. "Excuse me," Marcus said, his voice strained with pain. "I need to see a doctor." The nurse looked up, her eyes quickly scanning his face before flicking down to the intake form in front of her. She seemed to hesitate for a moment, then handed him a clipboard with a pen attached. "Fill this out and take a seat," she said, her tone flat. Marcus took the clipboard, but the pain in his side flared up again, causing him to gasp and clutch the counter for support. The nurse noticed his struggle, her expression softening slightly. She reached out, taking the clipboard from him. "Let me just get some basic information," she said more gently. "Name? Marcus Harris," he managed to say through gritted teeth. "Date of birth? January 12th, 1978. "Okay, Mr. Harris," she said, typing the information into the computer. "I'll let the doctor know you're here. You can take a seat while you wait." Marcus nodded, grateful to be spared the task of filling out forms in his condition. He shuffled over to one of the chairs and lowered himself into it carefully, trying to find a position that would ease the pain. It wasn't working. He could feel the sweat starting to beat on his forehead, despite the cool air of the room. Minutes felt like hours as he waited. Every movement sent a jolt of pain through his abdomen, and he found himself gripping the armrests of the chair, his knuckles white. He glanced around the room, trying to distract himself. A mother was comforting a crying child in the corner, while an older man sat with a bandaged hand, staring blankly at the TV mounted on the wall. Finally, after what seemed like an eternity, a door to the side of the reception desk opened, and a tall, silver-haired man in a white coat stepped out. His expression was unreadable as he looked around the room, his eyes landing on Marcus. "Mr. Harris?" the doctor called out. Marcus struggled to his feet, every movement a battle against the pain. The doctor waited, arms crossed, as Marcus approached him. "Come with me," the doctor said, turning on his heel and leading Marcus down a narrow hallway. The walls were lined with framed certificates and outdated medical posters, the fluorescent lights overhead buzzing faintly. The doctor pushed open a door to an examination room and gestured for Marcus to sit on the bed. Marcus complied, lowering himself onto the crinkling paper-covered bed. The doctor flipped through a chart, his eyes scanning the information. "Dr. Caldwell," the man said, finally introducing himself without looking up. "What seems to be the problem?" "It's my side, doctor," Marcus said, wincing as he touched his abdomen. "The pain started this morning, but it's been getting worse all day. I can barely stand it now." Dr. Caldwell glanced up from the chart, his eyes cold and assessing. He reached out, prodding Marcus's abdomen with practiced detachment. Caldwell muttered, his face giving away nothing. "Probably just indigestion or maybe some mild gastritis. You've been under any stress lately?" "No more than usual," Marcus replied, trying to keep his frustration in check. "But this pain, it doesn't feel like something small. It's sharp, like something's tearing inside." Caldwell raised an eyebrow, clearly unimpressed. "You people often misinterpret pain. Our bodies react differently to stress, diet, even anxiety. It's nothing to worry about." Marcus felt a flash of anger, but it was quickly drowned out by the pain. "Doctor, I know my body. This isn't normal. Can't you do some tests?" Caldwell sighed, clearly annoyed by the persistence. He looked Marcus up and down, as if weighing whether or not it was worth his time. "Look," Caldwell said, his tone dismissive, "I've seen hundreds of cases like this. Go home, get some rest, take an antacid. If it doesn't go away in a few days, come back. But I'm telling you, it's nothing serious." Marcus stared at the doctor, disbelief and frustration mixing with the pain. He opened his mouth to argue, but the look on Caldwell's face made it clear the conversation was over. The doctor turned away, already making notes on the chart. "Thank you," Marcus said, though it felt more like a forced courtesy than genuine gratitude. He slid off the examination bed, each movement sending fresh waves of pain through his body. Caldwell didn't even look up as Marcus left the room, walking back into the dimly lit hallway, feeling more defeated than when he'd arrived. As he made his way back to the waiting area, Marcus felt a deep sense of unease. Something was wrong, and no amount of brushing off by a dismissive doctor would change that. But what could he do? He was just a patient, and Dr. Caldwell was the professional. He had no choice but to follow his advice, even if every instinct in his body told him otherwise. He paused for a moment, leaning against the wall to steady himself, then slowly made his way back to the reception area, the pain in his side gnawing at him like a relentless predator. The journey back to his car seemed even longer than when he'd arrived. The darkness outside had deepened, the parking lot now bathed in the cold blue light of the street lamps. Marcus's mind raced with doubt and fear as he fumbled with his keys, wondering if he'd made a terrible mistake by trusting Dr. Caldwell's judgment. The ride home was a blur for Marcus. Each bump in the road sent a fresh wave of pain through his side, making it hard to focus on anything but the throbbing in his abdomen. The streetlights flickered by, casting brief moments of light into the darkness of the car's interior. But they did little to illuminate the confusion and frustration swirling in his mind. As he pulled into his driveway, Marcus hesitated before turning off the engine. He sat there for a moment, gripping the steering wheel, trying to make sense of what had just happened. Dr. Caldwell's dismissive words echoed in his ears, mixing with the relentless pain in his side. Probably just indigestion, stress, nothing serious, but it didn't feel like nothing. It felt like something was tearing him apart from the inside. He shook his head, trying to push the doubt away, but it clung to him like a stubborn fog. Finally, he turned off the engine and stepped out of the car. The cool night air hit him like a wave, momentarily distracting him from the pain. He walked slowly to his front door, each step careful and deliberate. The keys jingled in his hand as he unlocked the door and stepped inside. The house was quiet, too quiet. Normally, the silence would have been a comfort after a long day, but tonight it felt oppressive, like the walls were closing in on him. He made his way to the kitchen, hoping that maybe a glass of water or a light snack would help. But as he reached for a glass, the pain flared up again, sharper than before. He dropped the glass, and it shattered on the floor, the sound loud and jarring in the empty house. Marcus doubled over, clutching his side, trying to breathe through the pain. His mind raced, trying to remember what Dr. Caldwell had said. Rest. Antacid. Come back if it gets worse. But the pain was already worse. Far worse than when he'd been at the hospital. He staggered to the bathroom, fumbling through the medicine cabinet until he found a bottle of antacids. He popped a couple into his mouth, chewing them quickly, but they felt like chalk against his tongue, offering no relief. He gripped the edge of the sink, staring at his reflection in the mirror. His face was pale, sweat beading on his forehead. He looked like a man who was unraveling, and in a way, he was. Marcus stumbled back to the living room, collapsing onto the couch. He pulled his phone from his pocket, staring at it as if it held the answer to his problems. He could call the hospital, demand to see another doctor. But what would he say? That he didn't trust Caldwell's judgment? That he was convinced something was seriously wrong despite what the doctor had told him? He scrolled through his contacts, landing on his sister's name. She'd always been the voice of reason in his life, the one he turned to when he needed advice. But it was late, and he didn't want to worry her. He hovered over the call button for a moment before closing the phone and tossing it onto the coffee table. You people often misinterpret pain. Caldwell's voice rang in his ears, the words heavy with condescension. Marcus clenched his fists, anger boiling up inside him. How could the doctor be so sure? How could he just dismiss Marcus's pain like it was nothing? The pain in his side flared again, pulling Marcus from his thoughts. He gasped, pressing his hand against his side as if he could somehow hold the pain at bay. It was getting worse. There was no denying that now. But what was he supposed to do? Go back to the hospital just to be turned away again? He leaned back on the couch, closing his eyes, trying to focus on anything but the pain. He pictured his sister's face, her voice telling him to stay calm, to think things through. He could hear her now, saying that he should go back to the hospital, that he needed to push for a proper examination. But would they even listen? Or would he be dismissed again, Sent home with nothing more than empty reassurances. Minutes turned into hours as Marcus lay there, drifting in and out of a restless sleep. Each time he woke, the pain was still there, gnawing at him like a relentless predator. By the time the first light of dawn crept through the windows, Marcus knew he couldn't wait any longer. He needed help, and if Caldwell wouldn't provide it, he'd have to find someone who would. With a groan, Marcus forced himself up from the couch, his body protesting every movement. He grabbed his phone again, scrolling through his contacts until he found the number for the hospital. His finger hovered over the call button, doubt gnawing at him. But then another jolt of pain hit, and the doubt vanished. He pressed the button and held the phone to his ear, listening as it rang, each second feeling like an eternity. Finally, a voice answered on the other end. "St. Mary's Hospital, how can I direct your call?" Marcus took a deep breath, trying to steady his voice. I need to speak with a doctor," he said, his words coming out in a rush. "I was in last night, and the pain is worse. I need to see someone else. Please." There was a pause on the other end. Then the voice replied, "One moment, sir. I'll connect you to the emergency department." Marcus waited, his heart pounding in his chest, the pain in his side a constant reminder that something was terribly wrong. He wouldn't be dismissed again. He couldn't afford to be. Finally, the line clicked, and a new voice came on, this one calm and professional. "Emergency department, this is Dr. Patterson. How can I help you?" Marcus felt a wave of relief wash over him at the sound of her voice. He didn't know who Dr. Patterson was, but she didn't sound like Caldwell. She sounded like someone who would listen. "Dr. Patterson," Marcus began, his voice trembling slightly. "My name is Marcus Harris. I was in last night, saw Dr. Caldwell. He said it was just indigestion, but the pain, it's worse now. I need help. I need someone to take a closer look." There was a pause. Then Dr. Patterson's voice came back, firm but kind. "Mr. Harris, I'm sorry to hear you're still in pain. Why don't you come back in? I'll make sure you're seen as soon as you arrive." Marcus closed his eyes, relief mingling with the fear that had been gnawing at him all night. "Thank you, doctor. I'll be there as soon as I can." He ended the call and slowly got up from the couch, every movement a struggle against the pain that refused to let go. But this time, he wasn't going to be dismissed. This time, he would make sure someone listened. And maybe, just maybe, he'd finally get the help he so desperately needed. The sun was barely peeking over the horizon as Marcus pulled into the hospital parking lot for the second time in less than 12 hours. The morning light cast long shadows across the asphalt, giving the place an eerie stillness that was at odds with the urgency gnawing at him. Every movement was a battle against the pain that had become a constant, oppressive presence, gnawing away at him from the inside. He parked the car and sat for a moment, gathering his strength. The call with Dr. Patterson had given him a glimmer of hope, but doubt still lingered in the back of his mind. What if she was just like Caldwell? What if she dismissed him too? Marcus shook his head, trying to push the doubts away. He had no choice now. The pain was getting worse by the hour, and he couldn't bear the thought of being sent home again, left to suffer in silence. He needed to believe that this time would be different. Slowly, he forced himself out of the car and walked toward the entrance. The automatic doors slid open with a soft hiss, and the sterile scent of the hospital filled his nose, a sharp contrast to the cool morning air outside. The emergency room was quieter now, the early hour bringing a lull in the usual flow of patients. A different nurse sat at the reception desk this time, her face younger and more alert than the one from the night before. She looked up as Marcus approached, her expression shifting from neutral to concerned as she took in his hunched posture and the pain etched across his features. "Good morning," she said, her voice gentle. "How can I help you?" "Morning," Marcus replied, his voice hoarse from exhaustion and pain. "I spoke with Dr. Patterson earlier. She said she'd see me as soon as I got here." The nurse nodded, tapping something into the computer. "Just a moment, Mr. Harris. I'll let her know you've arrived." She picked up the phone, her voice a quiet murmur, as she spoke to someone on the other end. Marcus stood there, gripping the edge of the counter for support, trying to steady his breathing. The pain was worse than ever, a deep, throbbing agony that seemed to radiate out from his side and consume his entire body. After a moment, the nurse hung up the phone and looked at him with a reassuring smile. "Dr. Patterson is expecting you. She's finishing up with another patient, but she'll be out to see you in just a few minutes. Why don't you have a seat?" Marcus nodded, too tired to argue, and made his way to one of the empty chairs. He lowered himself into it carefully, his body protesting every movement. The minutes ticked by slowly, the quiet murmur of the hospital doing little to distract him from the pain. Finally, the door to the side of the reception desk opened, and a woman in her early 40s stepped out. She was of medium height, with dark hair pulled back into a neat bun and a calm, focused expression on her face. Unlike Caldwell's cold detachment, there was a warmth in her eyes that immediately put Marcus at ease. "Mr. Harris?" she called out, her gaze settling on him. Marcus struggled to his feet, wincing as he did so. "That's me," he said, his voice strained. Dr. Patterson walked over to him, extending a hand. "I'm Dr. Patterson. I understand you've been having some pretty severe pain." Marcus shook her hand, grateful for the firmness of her grip. "Yes, doctor, it's been getting worse since last night. I don't know what to do. Let's get you into an exam room so I can take a closer look," she said, her tone reassuring. "We'll figure this out together." She led Marcus down the same hallway he had walked the night before, but this time the journey felt different. Dr. Patterson's presence was steadying, her demeanor calm and confident in a way that made Marcus feel like he was finally in good hands. They entered an examination room, and Dr. Patterson gestured for Marcus to sit on the bed. As he lowered himself onto the crinkling paper, she pulled up a stool and sat across from him, her eyes scanning his face with concern. "Tell me everything, Mr. Harris," she said, her tone inviting him to speak freely. "Start from the beginning." Marcus took a deep breath, trying to organize his thoughts through the haze of pain. "It started as a dull ache yesterday morning, just a little discomfort in my side. But by the evening, it had turned into this sharp, stabbing pain. I couldn't stand it anymore, so I came here last night." Dr. Patterson nodded, listening intently. "And what happened then?" "I saw Dr. Caldwell," Marcus continued, a hint of bitterness creeping into his voice. "He poked around a bit, asked a few questions, and then told me it was probably just indigestion or stress. Said to go home, take an antacid, and come back if it got worse." Dr. Patterson's expression remained neutral, but Marcus could see the flicker of something in her eyes. Disapproval, perhaps, or frustration. "And did you take the antacid?" "Yes, but it didn't help at all," Marcus said, shaking his head. "The pain just kept getting worse. By this morning, I knew I couldn't wait any longer. That's when I called and spoke with you." Dr. Patterson stood up, moving closer to Marcus as she began a more thorough examination. She pressed gently on different parts of his abdomen, watching his face closely for any signs of discomfort. "Does this hurt?" she asked, her fingers probing just below his ribs. Marcus winced, nodding. "Yeah, that's where it's the worst." She continued the examination, her touch gentle but precise. After a few moments, she stepped back, her brow furrowed in thought. "Mr. Harris," she said, her voice serious, "I'm concerned about what you are describing. This doesn't sound like simple indigestion to me. I'd like to run some tests to get a better understanding of what's going on." Marcus felt a wave of relief wash over him at her words. Finally, someone was taking him seriously. "Thank you, doctor. I appreciate that." Dr. Patterson nodded, giving him a reassuring smile. "We'll start with some blood work and an ultrasound. It might take a little time to get the results, but I want to make sure we're not missing anything important." She stepped out of the room to make the necessary arrangements, leaving Marcus alone with his thoughts. The pain was still there, a constant companion, but for the first time since this ordeal began, he felt like he was on the path to finding answers. Dr. Patterson's professionalism and genuine concern were a stark contrast to Caldwell's dismissive attitude, and it gave Marcus hope that whatever was wrong with him would soon be identified. After a short wait, a nurse entered the room to draw his blood and prepare him for the ultrasound. Marcus sat quietly, his mind racing with thoughts of what the tests might reveal. He knew it was too early to jump to conclusions, but he couldn't help but wonder what was causing the pain. The fear of the unknown gnawed at him, but he pushed it aside, focusing on the fact that he was finally getting the attention he needed. When Dr. Patterson returned, she was holding a folder with the initial results. Her face was serious, but there was a hint of determination in her eyes. "Mr. Harris," she began, sitting down across from him again, "the blood work shows some elevated levels that concern me, and the ultrasound indicates there might be an issue with your appendix. I'm going to recommend an immediate CT scan to confirm what we're seeing." Marcus felt his heart skip a beat. "My appendix? You think it might be?" "It's possible that you're experiencing appendicitis, which is a serious condition that requires prompt treatment," Dr. Patterson explained, her tone calm but urgent. If that's the case, we'll need to take action quickly, but I don't want to speculate too much until we have the CT scan results. Marcus nodded, his mind reeling from the sudden shift in the conversation. Just a few hours ago, he had been told it was nothing serious, that he was overreacting. Now he was facing the possibility of a serious medical emergency. "Thank you, doctor," Marcus said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Thank you for taking me seriously." Dr. Patterson reached out, placing a reassuring hand on his arm. "You did the right thing by coming back, Mr. Harris. We're going to take care of this." With that, she stood up, ready to arrange for the CT scan. As she left the room, Marcus felt a mix of emotions: fear, relief, anger. But most of all, he felt grateful. Grateful that someone had finally listened, that he wasn't alone in this anymore. As the door closed behind Dr. Patterson, Marcus leaned back on the examination bed, taking a deep breath. The pain was still there, gnawing at him relentlessly, but now, at least, he had a glimmer of hope that it wouldn't last forever. Marcus lay on the cold examination table, staring up at the sterile ceiling tiles as the machine hummed around him. The CT scan was taking longer than he expected, each minute dragging on as he waited for the whirring noise to stop. Every time the machine rotated, he imagined it capturing images of the pain inside him, finally giving a name to the agony that had haunted him for days. The room was dimly lit, and the only sounds were the steady hum of the machine and the distant murmur of hospital staff outside. Marcus tried to keep still, focusing on his breathing, but the pain made it hard. It had become a part of him now, an unwelcome companion that refused to be ignored. Finally, the machine powered down, and the technician slid the table out. "All done, Mr. Harris," she said, her voice calm and professional. "The doctor will have the results soon. Let me help you back to the room." Marcus nodded, too exhausted to respond. He was grateful when the technician offered him a hand and helped him to his feet. The walk back to the examination room felt longer than before, his body heavy with fatigue and the ever-present pain. When they arrived, the technician helped him onto the bed and left him alone to wait. Time seemed to crawl. Marcus tried to distract himself, looking around the room at the medical posters and equipment, but his mind kept circling back to one question: what if it's serious? He closed his eyes, trying to push the thought away, but it wouldn't leave. The possibility of something being seriously wrong had gnawed at him ever since the pain started, and now that they were so close to finding out the truth, the fear felt almost suffocating. A knock on the door pulled Marcus from his thoughts. He opened his eyes to see Dr. Patterson entering the room, her expression serious but not grim. She held a folder in her hand, the results from the scan. Marcus sat up slightly, his heart pounding as he tried to read her face. "Mr. Harris," Dr. Patterson began, closing the door behind her. She moved to the side of the bed, pulling up a stool to sit beside him. "I've reviewed your CT scan results, and I want to explain what we found." Marcus nodded, his throat dry. "Okay." Dr. Patterson opened the folder, revealing a few black and white images of his abdomen. She pointed to one of them, her finger tracing over a specific area. "This here is your appendix. It's inflamed, which confirms that you have appendicitis." The words hit Marcus like a punch to the gut, but at the same time, they brought a strange sense of relief. "So that's what it is. It wasn't just in my head." He nodded slowly, processing the information. What happens now?" "Appendicitis is a serious condition," Dr. Patterson continued, her tone professional yet empathetic. "If left untreated, it can lead to complications, including a ruptured appendix, which would be life-threatening. The best course of action is to remove the appendix surgically as soon as possible." Marcus swallowed hard, the reality of the situation sinking in. "Surgery? How soon?" "As soon as we can get you into the operating room," Dr. Patterson replied. "I've already spoken to the surgical team, and they're preparing now. We'll be moving you to the pre-op area shortly." The fear that had been lurking in the back of Marcus's mind surged forward, gripping him tightly. Surgery. The word alone was enough to send a chill down his spine. But the way Dr. Patterson spoke, with such certainty and calm, reassured him. This wasn't an option. This was a necessity. And for the first time since the pain began, he felt a sense of clarity. This was what needed to be done. "I understand," Marcus said, his voice steadier than he felt. "Thank you, doctor, for everything." Dr. Patterson gave him a small, encouraging smile. "You're in good hands, Mr. Harris. The surgical team is excellent, and I'll be with you every step of the way. Do you have any questions?" Marcus shook his head, the weight of the situation pressing down on him. No, I think I understand. I want this to be over. It will be soon, Dr. Patterson assured him. She stood up, placing a reassuring hand on his arm. I'll have the nurse come in and get you prepped. We'll take care of you. As she left the room, Marcus leaned back against the pillows, trying to calm the storm of emotions swirling inside him. The fear was still there, but it was tempered by the knowledge that help was on the way. He wasn't alone in this fight anymore. After a few minutes, a nurse entered, her demeanor efficient yet kind. She explained the steps to get him ready for surgery, but Marcus barely heard her. His mind was elsewhere, racing through everything that had led up to this moment. Caldwell's dismissiveness, the sleepless night of pain, the call with Dr. Patterson. It all seemed like a bad dream, one he was finally waking up from. The nurse handed him a hospital gown and helped him change, then started an IV in his arm. Marcus watched the clear fluid drip steadily into the tube, a reminder that the process was now out of his hands. He was placing his trust in the doctors, in the hospital staff, in the machines and the sterile environment that surrounded him. Once the nurse finished, she gave him a reassuring smile. You're all set, Mr. Harris. We'll be taking you to the operating room shortly. Just try to relax. Marcus nodded, his heart pounding. Thank you. As she left the room, Marcus took a deep breath, staring up at the ceiling. The pain in his side was still there, a relentless reminder of what had brought him to this point. But now there was an end in sight. He just had to get through this one last hurdle. A few minutes later, the door opened again, and this time it was two orderlies pushing a gurney. They helped Marcus onto it, their movements efficient but careful, making sure he was comfortable before they wheeled him out of the room. The hallway was quiet, the early morning light filtering through the windows as they made their way to the operating room. Marcus focused on the ceiling tiles passing by, trying to keep his mind calm. This was it, the moment he'd been dreading and hoping for all at once. As they approached the double doors leading to the surgical suite, Dr. Patterson appeared again, dressed in scrubs. She walked alongside the gurney, her presence a comforting anchor in the sea of uncertainty. We're going to take good care of you, Mr. Harris, she said, her voice steady. The surgery is routine, and you'll be back on your feet in no time. Marcus managed a weak smile, grateful for her words. I trust you, doctor. They reached the doors, and Dr. Patterson placed a hand on his shoulder. I'll see you in the operating room. Just take deep breaths and try to relax. You're in good hands. Marcus nodded, closing his eyes as they wheeled him through the doors. The last thing he heard before the anesthesia took hold was Dr. Patterson's calm voice, guiding him into the darkness with the promise of light on the other side. Marcus blinked against the harsh fluorescent lights overhead as he slowly regained consciousness. The world around him was a blur of white walls and soft beeping sounds, the steady rhythm of the heart monitor reassuring in its consistency. His body felt heavy, weighed down by the lingering effects of anesthesia, but the sharp, gnawing pain in his side was gone, replaced by a dull, manageable ache. He was alive. The surgery was over. A nurse appeared beside him, her face kind and attentive. Welcome back, Mr. Harris. How are you feeling? Marcus took a moment to gather his thoughts. His throat was dripping and his voice came out raspy. Tired, but better, I think. That's good to hear, the nurse said with a warm smile. The surgery went well. Dr. Patterson will be in to see you shortly, but in the meantime, just rest. You're in the recovery room, and we'll be moving you to a regular room soon. Marcus nodded, closing his eyes briefly. The relief of being on the other side of the ordeal washed over him, and he allowed himself a moment of peace. The nurse adjusted his blankets and checked the monitors before stepping away, leaving Marcus alone with his thoughts. He drifted in and out of sleep for what felt like hours, the haze of exhaustion mingling with the remnants of the anesthesia. At some point, he was moved to a private room, the environment quieter and more comfortable. The steady pulse of the IV in his arm and the soft murmur of the machines became a comforting background noise as he slowly came back to full awareness. It was in this state that Dr. Patterson appeared, dressed in her usual white coat, her expression one of calm professionalism tinged with genuine concern. She pulled up a chair beside his bed and sat down, her eyes meeting his. How are you feeling, Mr. Harris? She asked, her voice soft. Better, Marcus replied, managing a small smile. Thank you, doctor, for everything. Dr. Patterson returned the smile, her eyes warm. You're welcome. The surgery was successful and we were able to remove the appendix before it ruptured. You're going to be just fine." The weight of her words settled over him, bringing with it a profound sense of relief. He had made it through the worst of it. The nightmare was finally over. As Marcus shifted slightly in bed, adjusting to a more comfortable position, a thought crept into his mind, one that had been lurking ever since he'd first spoken with Dr. Patterson. "Doctor, what happens now with Dr. Caldwell, I mean?" Dr. Patterson's expression shifted, a flicker of something unreadable passing over her features. "Mr. Harris, I want you to know that what happened with Dr. Caldwell was not acceptable. Your concerns should have been taken seriously from the beginning, and I'm deeply sorry that they weren't." Marcus nodded, the frustration he'd felt the night before resurfacing. "He didn't even try to listen, just dismissed me like I was wasting his time." Dr. Patterson's gaze softened with empathy. "I understand how upsetting that must have been. I've already spoken to the hospital administration about what happened. They're taking your complaint seriously and will be conducting a thorough review of Dr. Caldwell's actions." "What does that mean?" Marcus asked, a mix of curiosity and concern in his voice. "It means that the hospital will investigate the situation," Dr. Patterson explained. "They'll look into how Dr. Caldwell handled your case and whether his behavior was in line with the standards of care we expect from our staff. Depending on the findings, there could be consequences for him." Marcus absorbed this information, his mind churning with the implications. "So he might get fired?" Dr. Patterson hesitated, choosing her words carefully. "It's possible, depending on what the investigation reveals. But I want you to know that your voice has been heard, Mr. Harris. The hospital is committed to ensuring that something like this doesn't happen again." A part of Marcus felt vindicated by her words, knowing that Caldwell would be held accountable. But another part of him was conflicted, unsure of how to feel. He wasn't the kind of person who wanted to ruin someone's career, even if Caldwell had wronged him. Sensing his inner turmoil, Dr. Patterson leaned forward slightly, her tone gentle. "It's understandable if you have mixed feelings about this. No one wants to see a situation like this escalate. But it's important that we hold ourselves to the highest standards, especially in a profession where people's lives are at stake." Marcus looked up at her, appreciating the honesty in her words. I don't want this to happen to anyone else. It's not right." "And it won't," Dr. Patterson assured him. "The hospital is taking steps to make sure that all patients are treated with the respect and care they deserve. You did the right thing by speaking up." Marcus nodded slowly, the tension in his chest easing a little. He didn't regret pushing back against Caldwell's treatment of him, but the reality of the situation was still difficult to process. "Thank you," he said quietly, the words carrying more weight than he realized, "for listening, for taking me seriously." Dr. Patterson gave him a small, encouraging smile. "It's my job, Mr. Harris, and it's one I take very seriously. You should rest now. Your body needs time to heal, and we'll be here to support you through that process." Marcus settled back against the pillows, feeling a sense of closure, though he knew the journey wasn't quite over. "I will. Thank you, doctor." As Dr. Patterson stood to leave, she paused at the door, turning back to him. "If you need anything, don't hesitate to call. I'll check on you later." With that, she left the room, leaving Marcus alone with his thoughts. The conversation had brought him a measure of peace, but it also left him with a lot to think about. He had come to the hospital in pain, desperate for help, and had been dismissed without a second thought. It had taken another doctor's intervention to get the care he needed, and now the consequences of Caldwell's actions were unfolding. Marcus closed his eyes, the events of the past day swirling in his mind. The fear, the anger, the relief, they were all there, mingling with the physical exhaustion that had settled deep in his bones. He knew he had done the right thing by speaking up, but the road ahead still seemed uncertain. As he drifted off to sleep, Marcus couldn't help but wonder what would happen next. Would Caldwell be held accountable? Would the hospital truly change? And would he ever feel completely at ease in a place that had once seemed so indifferent to his suffering? The answers would come in time, he knew. But for now, all he could do was rest and hope that the worst was behind him. The days following the surgery passed in a blur of medication, rest, and cautious movements. Marcus's body was healing, but the emotional toll of the ordeal lingered. The hospital room, with its muted colors and constant activity just beyond the door, became both a sanctuary and a prison. Each time a nurse or doctor entered, Marcus felt a mix of gratitude and wariness, the memory of Caldwell's dismissal never far from his mind. It was during one of these quiet moments, the afternoon sun casting a warm glow through the partially drawn blinds, that Marcus received an unexpected visitor. He was sitting up in bed, absent-mindedly flipping through a magazine, when a knock at the door startled him. Looking up, he was surprised to see his friend Jordan standing in the doorway, a concerned expression on his face. "Hey, man," Jordan said, stepping into the room. He was a tall, broad-shouldered man with a deep voice that always carried a hint of reassurance. Today, though, there was a tension in his voice that Marcus hadn't heard before. "How are you holding up?" Marcus set the magazine aside, a smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. "Better, I think. Just trying to take it one day at a time." Jordan pulled up a chair beside the bed, his eyes scanning Marcus's face as if searching for something unspoken. "I've been worried about you. When I heard what happened, I wanted to come sooner, but the hospital wouldn't let me in." "Yeah, they've been pretty strict with visitors," Marcus replied, his smile fading slightly. "But I'm glad you're here now. It's good to see a familiar face." Jordan nodded, leaning forward slightly. "I heard about Caldwell. That's some messed up stuff, man. How are you dealing with it?" Marcus sighed, running a hand through his hair. "It's been a lot. I keep thinking about how things could have gone differently if Dr. Patterson hadn't stepped in. Caldwell just brushed me off like I didn't matter." Jordan's expression darkened, his hands clenching into fists. "That kind of treatment isn't right, Marcus. You deserve better than that. We all do." "I know," Marcus agreed, the frustration he'd been holding back bubbling to the surface. "It's just, I don't know, man. I keep replaying it in my head, thinking about how I could have said something different or pushed harder. But at the time, I was in so much pain, I just wanted someone to listen. And that's exactly what they should have done," Jordan said firmly. "You were in pain, and Caldwell didn't take you seriously. That's on him, not you." Marcus looked at his friend, the unwavering support in Jordan's eyes giving him a sense of strength he hadn't felt in days. "I've filed a complaint, and Dr. Patterson said the hospital's taking it seriously. But I don't know what's going to happen. Part of me wants to see Caldwell face consequences, but another part of me just wants to move on." Jordan's gaze softened, and he leaned back in his chair, his tone more measured. "I get that. It's tough, man. You don't want to be the reason someone loses their job. But at the same time, what Caldwell did wasn't just a mistake. It was negligence, plain and simple." Marcus nodded, his mind swirling with conflicting emotions. "I just keep thinking, what if this happens to someone else? What if they're not as lucky as I was?" Jordan May was silent for a moment, his eyes thoughtful. "That's the thing, Marcus. By speaking up, you're not just standing up for yourself. You're standing up for everyone who's ever been in your position. Caldwell needs to be held accountable, not just for your sake, but for everyone who comes after you." The weight of Jordan's words settled over Marcus, and he realized that his friend was right. This wasn't just about what had happened to him. It was about making sure no one else had to go through the same ordeal. "You're right," Marcus said quietly, his resolve strengthening. "I can't just let this go. I have to see this through." Jordan nodded, a small smile of approval on his face. "That's the Marcus I know. You're stronger than you think, man. And you've got people who have your back." Marcus felt a surge of gratitude for his friend, the warmth of their bond cutting through the lingering bitterness. "Thanks, Jordan. I really appreciate that." "Any time, man," Jordan replied, standing up and clapping a hand on Marcus's shoulder. "And don't worry, I'll be here with you every step of the way. We'll make sure Caldwell gets what's coming to him." The two men shared a look of understanding, a silent agreement that whatever lay ahead, they would face it together. As Jordan left the room, Marcus felt a renewed sense of purpose. He wasn't just fighting for himself. He was fighting for everyone who had ever been dismissed, ignored, or treated as less than they deserved. The rest of the day passed more quickly, the minutes slipping by as Marcus focused on his recovery. The pain from the surgery was manageable, and each passing hour brought him closer to being discharged from the hospital. But the real challenge, he knew, lay beyond these walls. That evening, Dr. Patterson stopped by again, her expression more relaxed now that Marcus was on the mend. They discussed his recovery plan, the steps he would need to take to regain his strength, and the importance of following up with his primary care physician once he was home. Before she left, Marcus brought up Caldwell again, his voice steady. "Dr. Patterson, I've been thinking a lot about what happened with Dr. Caldwell. I want to make sure that something like this doesn't happen to anyone else." Dr. Patterson nodded, her eyes meeting his. "I understand, Mr. Harris. The hospital is taking this very seriously, and I want you to know that your concerns are being heard. The investigation is ongoing and I'll make sure you're kept informed about any developments. Marcus felt a sense of relief at her words, knowing that he wasn't alone in this fight. Thank you, Doctor. That means a lot to me. You've been through a lot, Mr. Harris, Dr. Patterson said, her voice gentle. But you're stronger than you realize. You're not just a patient, you're an advocate for change. And that's something to be proud of. As she left the room, Marcus leaned back against the pillows, a sense of determination settling over him. The path ahead wouldn't be easy, but he was ready to face it. He was ready to stand up for himself and for others who might find themselves in his shoes. The next morning, Marcus was discharged from the hospital. His body still sore, but his spirit stronger than it had been in days. Jordan was there to pick him up, and as they drove away from the hospital, Marcus looked back at the building, a sense of closure mingling with the knowledge that the journey wasn't over yet. But he was ready. He had survived the worst of it, and now, with Jordan by his side and a newfound sense of purpose, he was prepared to take on whatever came next. The weeks following Marcus's discharge from the hospital were a whirlwind of physical recovery and emotional reflection. His body healed steadily, though the pain of the surgery lingered as a constant reminder of what he had been through. But it wasn't just his physical wounds that needed mending. Marcus knew that the real battle was still ahead. It began with a phone call. One afternoon, as Marcus was settling into the routine of being back home, his phone rang. The number was unfamiliar, but something in his gut told him to answer. Hello? Mr. Harris, this is Lisa Hammond from the hospital administration. I'm calling to follow up on your complaint against Dr. Caldwell. Marcus felt his pulse quicken. Yes, I remember. What's going on? First, I want to apologize again for what you went through, Lisa said, her tone professional but empathetic. The hospital has been conducting an investigation into Dr. Caldwell's conduct, and we've uncovered some troubling patterns. It appears that your case was not an isolated incident. Marcus's grip tightened on the phone. What do you mean? We've found that several other patients have lodged complaints against Dr. Caldwell for similar behavior, Lisa explained. Dismissal of symptoms, refusal to take concerns seriously, and in some cases even hostile interactions. This has prompted the hospital to take immediate action. Marcus's mind raced as he processed her words. He had known that what Caldwell did was wrong, but hearing that it wasn't an isolated incident made his anger flare anew. So what happens now? Dr. Caldwell has been placed on administrative leave pending a full review, Lisa said. The hospital board is considering the next steps, which could include suspension or termination, depending on the findings. A part of Marcus felt a surge of satisfaction at hearing this. Caldwell was finally being held accountable, but there was another part of him that remained wary. Is there anything I need to do? He asked. Actually, yes, Lisa replied. We're holding a formal hearing in a few weeks, and we'd like you to testify about your experience. Your testimony could be crucial in determining the outcome. Marcus hesitated, the weight of the request settling over him. Testifying meant reliving the trauma, facing Caldwell, and opening himself up to scrutiny. But it also meant standing up for himself and for those other patients who had been dismissed and ignored. I'll do it, Marcus said, his voice firm. I'll testify. Thank you, Mr. Harris, Lisa said, relief evident in her voice. I know this isn't easy, but your courage is going to make a difference. We'll be in touch with more details soon. After the call ended, Marcus sat in silence for a longer moment, the reality of what he had agreed to sinking in. He had taken the first step toward justice, but the path ahead was far from clear. That evening, Jordan came over, bringing dinner and his usual unshakable support. As they sat in the living room, eating takeout and watching TV, Marcus told him about the phone call and the upcoming hearing. Jordan listened quietly, his face thoughtful. That's big, man. You're really doing it. Yeah, Marcus replied, pushing his food around his plate. It feels like a lot. I've never done anything like this before. You don't have to do it alone, Jordan said, his tone reassuring. I'll be there with you every step of the way. And I know it's scary, but you're doing the right thing. Caldwell needs to answer for what he did. Marcus nodded, appreciating his friend's unwavering confidence in him. I just hope I can get through it without freezing up. I'm not exactly great with public speaking, Jordan chuckled, his laughter lightening the mood. Just be yourself, man. Tell the truth. You've got nothing to hide, and Caldwell's the one who messed up. The truth's on your side. The two friends talked late into the night, discussing the upcoming hearing, strategizing about what Marcus might say, and sharing their frustrations and hopes. By the time Jordan left, Marcus felt more prepared, more resolved to see this through. The day of the hearing arrived sooner than Marcus expected. He woke up early that morning, nerves making his stomach churn. He dressed carefully in a simple button-up shirt and slacks, his hands shaking slightly as he adjusted his collar. Jordan arrived soon after, offering a steadying presence as they drove to the hospital together. The hearing was held in a conference room, the setting more intimidating than Marcus had anticipated. A long table dominated the room with several hospital administrators seated on one side and a handful of other people, likely witnesses, on the other. Marcus recognized Lisa Hammond among them, her expression calm and reassuring as she acknowledged him with a nod. At the far end of the table sat Dr. Caldwell, his face a mask of indifference by Ganesh. Seeing him again made Marcus's pulse quicken, a mix of anger and anxiety bubbling up inside him. This was the man who had dismissed his pain, who had nearly cost him his life with his arrogance. But Marcus wasn't the same person he had been that night. He was stronger now, more determined, and he wasn't going to let Caldwell's presence intimidate him. The proceedings began with formalities, the hospital's legal team outlining the charges against Caldwell. Marcus listened intently, his nerves slowly giving way to a growing sense of purpose. When it was his turn to speak, Lisa introduced him and asked him to share his story. Marcus took a deep breath and began, his voice steady despite the tension in the room. He recounted the events of that night, how he had arrived at the hospital in pain, how Caldwell had dismissed his symptoms, and how it had taken Dr. Patterson's intervention to get the treatment he needed. As he spoke, he noticed Caldwell's expression harden, a flicker of irritation crossing the doctor's face. But Marcus didn't let it deter him. He pressed on, describing the fear and frustration he had felt, the sense of helplessness as he had been ignored. When he finished, the room was silent for a moment. Then one of the administrators, a stern-looking woman with glasses perched on the edge of her nose, asked, "Mr. Harris, how did Dr. Caldwell's actions affect you beyond the immediate medical concerns?" Marcus paused, considering the question. "It made me feel like I didn't matter," he said finally, "like my pain wasn't real, or like I was just wasting his time. I was scared, and I didn't know what was wrong with me, but he didn't seem to care. I don't want anyone else to feel like that, especially when they're in a situation where they need help the most." The administrator nodded, her expression serious. "Thank you, Mr. Harris. Your testimony has been very helpful." Marcus returned to his seat, his heart pounding, but a sense of relief washing over him. He had done it. He had spoken up, and now it was up to the hospital to take action. The hearing continued with other witnesses, each recounting their own experiences with Caldwell. Marcus listened, his anger simmering as he realized just how many people had been affected by the doctor's negligence. These weren't just isolated incidents, they were part of a pattern, one that the hospital could no longer ignore. When the hearing finally concluded, the administrators promised to deliver their decision within the week. Marcus left the hospital with Jordan by his side, the weight of the day's events pressing down on him. "You did great, man," Jordan said as they walked to the car. "I'm proud of you." "Thanks," Marcus replied, feeling a mix of exhaustion and relief. "I'm just glad it's over. Now we just have to wait and see what they decide." "Whatever happens, you've already made a difference," Jordan said, his voice steady. "You stood up for yourself, and for a lot of other people too. That's something to be proud of." As they drove away from the hospital, Marcus looked out the window, the city passing by in a blur. He had faced one of the biggest challenges of his life and come out stronger for it. Now all that was left was to wait for the hospital's decision, and whatever it would bring, Marcus knew he was ready to face it head on. The week following the hearing was one of the longest of Marcus's life. Each day dragged by, the hours ticking away with agonizing slowness as he waited for the hospital's decision. He tried to keep busy, focusing on his physical recovery, catching up on work, and spending time with Jordan, who had been a constant source of support. But no matter how hard he tried to distract himself, the uncertainty gnawed at him. One afternoon, as Marcus sat in his living room, flipping through the channels on TV without really watching anything, his phone buzzed. He grabbed it, his heart leaping into his throat when he saw the caller ID, Lisa Hammond. He took a deep breath before answering. "Hello? Mr. Harris, it's Lisa Hammond. I'm calling to inform you that the hospital board has reached a decision regarding Dr. Caldwell." Marcus's grip tightened on the phone. "Okay. I know this has been a difficult time for you, so I want to start by thanking you again for your courage in coming forward," Lisa said, her tone calm and measured. The board has reviewed all the evidence, including your testimony and the accounts from other patients. After careful consideration, they have decided to terminate Dr. Caldwell's employment with the hospital. For a moment, Marcus couldn't speak. He had hoped for this outcome, but hearing it confirmed left him momentarily stunned. He's fired? Yes, Lisa confirmed, effective immediately. The board determined that Dr. Caldwell's conduct was not only unprofessional, but posed a significant risk to patient safety. The hospital cannot and will not tolerate that kind of behavior. Marcus let out a long breath, a mix of relief and disbelief washing over him. Caldwell was gone. The man who had dismissed his pain, who had made him feel small and insignificant, had been held accountable. It was more than Marcus had dared to hope for. "Thank you, Ms. Hammond," he finally managed to say. "I appreciate everything you have done." "It's the least we could do, Mr. Harris," Lisa replied. "We want you to know that your experience has prompted the hospital to reevaluate our policies and procedures. We're committed to ensuring that no patient ever feels unheard or neglected again. Your voice has made a difference." "That means a lot," Marcus said, his voice soft. "I just hope this helps prevent it from happening to someone else." "I believe it will," Lisa assured him. "If you have any further concerns or questions, please don't hesitate to reach out. And again, thank you for your bravery in coming forward." After they ended the call, Marcus sat in silence for a long moment, the reality of what had just happened settling over him. Caldwell was gone. The man who had caused him so much pain, both physical and emotional, had faced consequences for his actions. It felt like a weight had been lifted off his shoulders, a burden he hadn't realized he had been carrying for so long. Later that day, Marcus called Jordan to share the news. His friend's reaction was immediate and emphatic. "That's what I'm talking about," Jordan exclaimed, his voice brimming with excitement. "They did the right thing, man. Caldwell had no business being a doctor if he couldn't treat people with the respect they deserve." "Yeah," Marcus agreed, a small smile tugging at his lips. "It's a relief to know that he won't be able to hurt anyone else. But it's still hard, you know? Part of me feels bad that he lost his job, but another part of me knows this had to happen." "Don't feel bad," Jordan said firmly. "He made his choices, and those choices had consequences. You did what you had to do, not just for yourself, but for everyone else who's ever been in your shoes. You should be proud of that." Marcus nodded, even though Jordan couldn't see him. "I am. I just didn't expect it to feel so complicated." "That's normal," Jordan replied. "But you did the right thing, and that's what matters. So what's next for you?" "I'm not sure," Marcus admitted. "I think I just need some time to process everything. This whole thing has been exhausting, and I could use a break." "Understandable," Jordan said. "Take all the time you need. And if you ever want to talk, you know where to find me." "Thanks, Jordan," Marcus said, feeling a surge of gratitude for his friend. "I appreciate that." After they hung up, Marcus decided to take a walk. The day was warm, the late afternoon sun casting a golden hue over the neighborhood. As he walked, he let his mind wander, reflecting on everything that had happened. The fear and frustration of that night in the ER, the anger and helplessness he had felt in the days that followed, the determination to seek justice, not just for himself, but for others who had been dismissed and ignored. He realized that this was more than just a victory for him. It was a victory for everyone who had ever been made to feel less than, who had been brushed aside by those in power. And while it didn't erase the pain or the trauma, it was a step toward healing. As Marcus rounded the corner to head back home, he felt a sense of peace that had eluded him for weeks. The fight wasn't over. There was still more work to be done, both in his own life and in the broader fight against the kind of injustice he had faced. But for the first time in a long while, Marcus felt like he was moving forward, like the future was his to shape. That evening, as he sat in his living room with a cup of tea, Marcus allowed himself to relax fully. The road ahead might still have its challenges, but he knew he had the strength to face them. He had stood up for himself, had made his voice heard, and had seen justice served. That was something no one could take away from him. As he sipped his tea, Marcus thought about the journey that had brought him to this point. It had been painful and difficult, but it had also shown him a side of himself he hadn't known existed, a side that was resilient, determined, and unafraid to stand up for what was right. He wasn't just a survivor, he was a fighter. And whatever came next, Marcus knew he was ready. The morning sun streamed through the windows, casting a warm golden light across Marcus's apartment. He stood in the kitchen, pouring himself a cup of coffee, the aroma filling the air as he leaned against the counter. It had been a few weeks since Dr. Caldwell's termination, and the immediate rush of emotions, relief, satisfaction, exhaustion, had finally begun to settle. Now there was a sense of calm that Marcus hadn't felt in a long time, a quiet confidence that things were moving in the right direction. As he sipped his coffee, Marcus thought about the journey he had been on, the fear and frustration of that night in the ER, the anger and helplessness he had felt afterward, the determination to fight for justice. It all seemed like a distant memory now, yet it had left an indelible mark on him. He had come out of it stronger, more self-assured, and more aware of the power of his own voice. Today, however, was about something different. It was about moving forward. Marcus had been offered a position at a new tech startup, a small but promising company that had reached out to him after hearing about his story. They were looking for someone with his skills and experience to help them grow, and the opportunity felt like the fresh start he needed. As he prepared for the day, Marcus felt a mix of excitement and nerves. The new job was a chance to leave the past behind and focus on something positive, something that would allow him to channel his energy into building rather than fighting. It was a new beginning, one that he was ready to embrace.